Can you tell me something about Games Monitor, why it was set up and what you do?
I joined Games Monitor in 2006. What was happening was that in 2005, I became involved with a group of people who had actually, some of them, been campaigning against the Olympics before, because I wasn't actually involved in any anti-Olympics campaigning before the Olympic bid was won. I was dreaming along, thinking that Paris was going to get it, and I was pretty uninterested in the whole thing. The day the Olympic bid was won was a date of extreme depression, because I kind of realised I was living in a fantasy world, and also I knew, to be quite blunt, that it was just going to go, and I was going to be sitting here probably a few years later saying, well, this is all a disaster, and it would be pointless saying it, because you'd just be sitting there saying this to people who believed it was going to be wonderful. Anyway, post the Olympic bid being won, I joined up with some of these people, went to some meetings, and it was mainly people who were arguing about the allotments and about what was happening in Hackney Marshes and stuff like that. Quite a lot of environmental campaigners, I would say. And because each group fought its own battles, so you didn't really have a coordinated campaign. I mean, I did get in touch with Lance Foreman, and I went to the allotments, but for the most part, each group was caught in its own struggle, the Eastway cyclists and so on. So each group, and even afterwards, we still didn't really coordinate our activities. And our objective, as it says in the website, is really to kind of demythologize, undermine the boosters, because the project is always launched as, you know, the best thing since sliced bread, and all of the claims that are made are and can be demolished, because actually they are simply false. I mean, like for example, sport participation. I mean, even the House of Commons Select Committee said you're not going to get any benefits from this. Game Plan has said it, tourism and so on. So we were sitting there thinking, well, okay, well now we're into just, we're just going to be there saying this is not what it's claiming to be. And essentially that is, I think our role is to go on saying it's not what it claims to be. And you look at the way in which the project develops, and to my mind, that is borne out. It sounds like, you know, well, okay, we're maybe out there to poke fun or just knock it, and to a certain extent that's true, because I actually do think it needs to be knocked. A lot of cities around the world now are very fed up with the Olympics, and I think Games Monitor has contributed to that, because London was not the benefit, was not the Great Games. It was a great party, but it wasn't the Great Games it was claimed to be. And in fact, when Boston, and they had a big argument in Boston about not having Olympics in Boston, the city that they concentrated most on was London, and the failures of the London Olympics to live up to expectations. The budget going completely out of control, tourism not producing the benefits, sport participation not producing benefits, and also pointing out that, of course, these games happen in places, by and large, where you can acquire cheap land, you buy it up, you remove the existing owners, and you go for property development, because that is what the Olympics is about. That's what's happening in Rio. Massive evictions, we're not talking about massive evictions in London, massive evictions of poor people and handing land over as part of the project to property developers. In the case of London, I don't think that has actually happened, because the way in which the London Games has happened is slightly peculiar, and it's concentrated inside of the Olympic Park. In other areas, you get these enormous programs, as in Rio, where basically the city starts saying, well, we'll do this here and do that there, and so they launch programs side by side with what is going on inside of the Olympic Park, which hasn't really happened so much in London.
This is a week of the Olympics taking place in Rio, and there's lots of news coverage, people interested for 2012, and one of the things that is recurring in that coverage is the desolate nature of London 2012, or Stratford before we had the Olympics. I wonder if you could tell me something about your impressions of Stratford before we hosted the Olympics.
Yeah, right. Well, the use of the word desolate, you see, that is the idea of the Olympic Park, which is now firmly fixed in the public mind. It was not desolate. It was a well-used, dynamic industrial site. And actually, if you look on the Sweetwater page of the LLDC's present website, it says the industrial area was a hive of activity and innovation. In other words, they completely changed the narrative about what was in that area. And businessmen who were in that area, like Lance Foreman, for example, will tell you it was a well-used, busy site. So this idea that this site needed to be cleared of the 5,000 jobs which were inside of it in order to redevelop Stratford is simply nonsense. Stratford already was going to host the £4 billion Stratford development project, which includes Westfield, the housing at the north end of the site and the international quarter. So that project goes back into the 1990s, the mid-1990s. The Stratford City Company was created in 1999. So this is a project which Newham had been working on for years. And there was actually at one point when the mayor of Newham was so fed up with the way in which the LDA, the London Development Agency, and Ken Livingstone were behaving towards Stratford City, that he said in a press release that, this is in November 2005, that the Olympics was threatening to wreck the consortium, to wreck Stratford City, because this is what they were really interested in. Stratford City is a £4 billion pound programme, remember, was actually bigger in terms of budget than the original Olympic budget, the £2.37 billion project. So in every respect, this is simply nonsense. If you look at what was happening in that area, the reason why these developments were happening, Stratford City, and of course Olympics as well, was because of the fantastic transport infrastructure that already existed in the Stratford station. So the transport infrastructure was in place. The Olympics didn't lead to transport infrastructure improvements. The only line which can be associated with the Olympics is the line from Canning Town to Stratford International Station. And that was already mapped out and planned. So actually everything else was in place. So you have a fantastic transport infrastructure. You have the fact that you're going to have this enormous development program on the rail lands, which were basically empty. There was a little bit of economic activity going on it, but basically this is land which was already vacant. And on top of that, actually, when people used to come and look at the Olympic Park, they used to be taken to a block of flats called Holden Point, and they would be then shown the Olympic Park. And what were they actually looking at? They were looking at the mud flats, which were to become Stratford City. The people who were showing them this tour, taking them on this tour, didn't point out that this was Stratford City and not the Olympic Park. So you actually had pictures, for example, in the Daily Mail and the Standard, which showed the area of Stratford City, which was completely vacant and just a big pile of mud. They were made to think that that was this desolate land. It wasn't. It wasn't even part of the Olympic Park. So there is so much misinformation around the way in which this site was developed. The very first time the Olympics that the LDA and London 2012 representatives came to speak to us, they said, your estate is going to be demolished even if the Olympics didn't come. And they had 3 diagrams, one of which was a non-Olympic scenario. And we then checked, we sent a Freedom of Information request to the LDA and said, well, can you tell us more about this plan? The response was, doesn't exist. And in fact, it never existed. There was a plan, apparently, commissioned 6 months after we'd been told the plan already existed. We were told this in the evidence of Jason Pryor to the compulsory purchase inquiry in 2006. And then in 2004, 6 months after we'd been told this, we were told that a plan was commissioned. It was then abandoned as unviable. So actually, we were not going to be demolished, and the estate would have survived, and other facilities in the Olympic Park would have survived. So you would have had development alongside what was there. You would have retained a lot of that industry, even as housing would have been built. That is the process that would have happened if the Olympics hadn't come. Our experience was that after we'd been lied to, we'd been told that our estate would be demolished regardless. We then went through the process of, we had a survey, a very good survey done by Fluid, but then they abandoned that. They just threw it away and said it's out of date. You know, they had a new survey. The first survey was really good, went through lots of different questions, what people wanted and what their concerns were. And then we had another survey, which was 5 questions. Where do you want to go? Have you got any disability? You know, do you like to move with somebody else? That was it. So that was, and then on the Fluid survey, they also listed a number of things they were going to do. They were going to have a rehousing alliance. They didn't do that. They were going to have a relocation strategy. They didn't do that. It was abandoned. They'd also asked us whether we wanted to move as a community, and in the Fluid survey, roughly half the population had said they were interested in that. So they then said we'll look for land. They didn't do it. So they actually, when the relocation program started, they had nothing. They didn't have any arrangements with any housing associations or councils. They hadn't done any research into land. They hadn't set up any of the things which they said they were going to do. In fact, the first time that someone came, the guy didn't know anything. He was completely silent. We were asking him questions and he was just saying, oh, I don't know. So that process continued, and during that process, people's compensation was deducted, I mean, we're talking about large sums of money here. Up to £2,000 was taken off people's compensation. The only deductions which were allowed, and actually even these should not really have been allowed, were for arrears, rent arrears. Now, that's a matter of negotiation because there were arguments about whether these the figures that were presented were correct, because there were accounts which were old and people weren't able to challenge them. So in reality, those cases should have gone to court. They should not have been dealt with just by saying we're going to take this off your compensation. But on top of that, people were told that they weren't entitled to be rehoused. I mean, it was a mess, frankly. And the same story arises with the businessmen. You go and talk to Lance Foreman or other businessmen, they were really upset. Originally, they were saying, they support the bid and so on. By the end of it, they had notices up saying no to London 2012. They think that they were really badly treated.
I wanted to ask you, was there ever a discussion about incorporating your estate into the plans?
No. No, essentially everything that was there was going to be demolished. You may remember the Manor Gardens allotments. They wanted to do that, and they came up with plans, and they said, we can find a way of keeping the allotments inside of the site. Once you're inside of the red line, basically you've gone. The whole thing about it being a wasteland, an urban desert, a scar was what Mr. Higgins called it. I mean, and now you have the LLDC turning around and saying, well, actually it was a hive of activity. So, I mean, this language to me indicates the way in which you just can't trust what the authorities say, I'm afraid. Lots of other instances. For example, the largest new park in Europe for 150 years. This was widely touted. It was repeated all over the media. I was doing a seminar once, was an academic there, and he came up with this. He said, yes, of course, we're going to have the largest new park in Europe. Nobody bothers to check this stuff. We did freedom of information requests for Games Monitor, and the ODA argued, no, of course it is. And I asked them, you got a list? No, I haven't got a list. How do you know? Well, somebody told us. I mean, it was as bad as that. And eventually, after a lot of argument, they said, okay, it's the largest new park in Europe after an Olympic Games, meaning Barcelona and Athens. I mean, that is the absurdity of this situation. It's not the largest new park in Europe, it's one that's larger in West London, which is about 20 years old. So it's this kind of nonsense, but this gets repeated without question. We have the same thing with the so-called remediation, a completely unnecessary program, because developers remediate sites when they go along to a site. And there are ways of doing this. You don't have to spend billions of pounds, well, they didn't spend billions of pounds, but hundreds of millions of pounds on this project. This is done by developers. There's lots of parts of the Olympic Park which would never have been touched, like for example the Eastway cycle track was a park. Nobody was ever going to do anything to that. You didn't have to dig it up in any form at all. Arena Fields, which was common land, and which has now got the media centre on it. This is common land, you don't build on common land, it's now got the media centre on it. Again, dug up for absolutely no reason at all.
I'm going to ask you about the CPO inquiry. Could you just talk about the kinds of things that you were raising at the CPO inquiry and what outcome you got through that inquiry?
Well, we had two issues basically. The first point was that initially we had what was called a round table discussion, and our purpose was, well, my purpose was, this is we sit around as a bunch of objectors, and the LDA and their team sit opposite us, and the inspector sits there and discusses with us a kind of open discussion about the issues. And in that discussion, I wanted to raise all of these kind of topics about about the benefits of the Olympics, whether there were benefits or whatever. Because you have to remember that before this program started, in end of 2002, the government, the Cabinet Office itself, the top echelon of the civil service, had produced a report which said don't expect to get benefits, economic benefits from the Olympics. So you have to ask yourself, why on earth? This report was signed by Tony Blair.
What was it that you were taking up with the CPO inquiry? Why were people on your estate concerned? What were they?
Well, as I said, it's kind of difficult to, unless you put it into the context of the way in which this program developed, it's kind of difficult to understand. You see, if you are up against a CPO, you're up against every single level of authority, which is saying this is the best project in the world, right? Absolutely. They're saying you're going to get tourism benefits, you're going to get sport participation benefits, you're going to get health benefits, you're going to get the redevelopment of the area. This is a fantastic project. And yet what I'm just trying to point out to you is that most of the stuff is rubbish. The regeneration project is simply nonsense. You've already got a massive regeneration project with a bigger budget than your original Olympic budget. And in 2006, that budget was still actually applying. So we're at a CPO inquiry in which you're up against barristers and so on telling you that this is the great project. So the point being, you see, is that you're up against every level of authority. You're up against the national government, the city government, the local authorities. They're all arguing the same thing. So in our initial attempt to argue with this, I in particular, but others as well, were trying to point out that the benefits that we're claiming were not going to happen. We were arguing, for example, tourism was not going to improve as a result of the Olympics. And in fact, in 2012, for the Olympic Games, tourism went down by 5%. And over the year, there was only a marginal rise, whereas the rise in the previous 2 years had been considerable. And after the Olympics, it went back to the same, the graph goes back to the same kind of rise. So the Olympics doesn't produce any benefits there at all. So we're trying to make those points. But of course, you're not going to get anywhere with that because this is a project which is supported by national government. So after we'd had this roundtable discussion, we actually managed to persuade some lawyers to take the case on. They said that they would do this pro bono, and at that point, the people who give us legal aid gave in and decided that they would fund it, which is very unusual. In fact, I don't think it's happened before. The CPO objector has been funded in this way, but whether that's the case or not, it was certainly unusual. But of course, the lawyers changed the agenda because they say, well, we don't think there's any point in doing that. What we have to argue is just about your narrow interest in staying on site. So our whole case completely changed to being us as victims, not the merits of the Olympic case at all. And actually, we had a set of experts who originally signed up, a company called Heifer Dixon, and then they just vanished. They said they wouldn't deal with the Olympics as a case as a whole, and then they just disappeared. So they just abandoned us halfway through. We don't know whether they were leaned on or whatever. So we had to bring in another expert who was a much smaller team. And everything then just revolves around, how do you combat this in terms of your own survival? But actually, that's a waste of time because, as I've said already, you're inside of the red line. The chances of your being able to argue your survival in the context of this project are virtually nil. The only thing you're really going to do is maybe get some sort of concession, which there were no concessions at all in our case. And in fact, when we presented evidence, for example, that we would be worse off, we reckoned we'd be about £58 on average a week worse off. The LDA said we'd be about £12 a week worse off. And the inspector simply...
We're talking about the rents.
We're talking about the rents. No, housing costs in general, because we're also talking... You see, we had a really good service charge. So we were cheap, and the accommodation as a whole was very cheap, and it included our council tax. So,
can you tell me how much it costs, just for comparison
what?
For today? Your housing costs.
Well, my housing costs, if I remember rightly, it's a long time ago now, I think they were £67 a week, all inclusive. Now, but the point being, though, that if you're... Anyway, the point about this is that the inspector simply decides what he's going to accept. So he says, I accept the LDA's figures. Actually, our figures were almost spot on. Not exactly the breakdown, but when you look at the information that comes out of the survey, which was done of residents, our figures are almost exactly correct. The inspector just ignored that. So he accepts the arguments which authority puts forward, and that is what tends to happen in these circumstances. Can you imagine an inspector saying, I don't advise that this CPO is accepted? No way. And of course, actually, the minister is the person who makes the decision anyway. So we then went to appeal, and we tried to do that on the basis of the fact that they hadn't done the relocation strategy. And again, the judge has said, well, you can't pick and choose, because we then also pointed out the various errors in the case, and he said you can't cherry pick. Basically, it's you go with it or you don't. Sorry, but it's out. So, the legal process is more or less a waste of time. I went into it because I'm kind of an argumentative person, but a lot of people just would just go. And in fact, in the estate, there was people were being rung up and told, you've got to go, come in and make your deal, and there was a pervasive attitude of fear. People were depressed. We had people in our group, and they just said we had a small group that was negotiating for a community move, and people just came along and said, I can't stick with this, I've got to go. So the group itself, we still had people in the group, but the group went down from 13 to 10 to 7. So people they didn't want to hang around.
Thank you. So moving on from Clays Lane. Just wanted to talk about housing developments on the park, whether you'd like to say anything about that you've been monitoring for quite some time.
Yeah, what we have, well, you have this problem of what you define as being a housing development for the park. On the website, it says, on the LDC website, they say they're going to create 10,000 homes. Now, actually, I did an interview with you and yours the other day, and the press spokesman for the LDC said they're going to create, I think it was 24,000. I don't know where he gets this figure from, but actually even the 10,000 figure is inaccurate, because in that figure they include the housing on the Athletes Village, which is not in the Olympic Park. It's part of the Stratford City development, and that site already had housing permission, and that was a site which would have been built even if the Olympics hadn't come. So, and in fact, the Olympics led to a decline in the amount of housing there. There was going to be 3,500 units. Eventually, they only had 2,818 units. They also include a site outside the Olympic Park at a place called Rick Roberts Way. And again, that's not in the Olympic Park. It's nothing to do with the legacy inside the Olympic Park. So you actually look at the figures inside the Olympic Park. They told me it was going to be 6,800 units, but that figure was incorrect, because when you add up the figures for the individual sites, it actually comes down to 6,650. And even that figure is incorrect, because they've also taken part of the site for the Olympicopolis site, which was going to have housing. So there's another 1,000 homes are not going to be built there. So you're down to 5,650 units inside of the Olympic Park from an original claim back in the time of the CPO of 9,600. And remember, the original claim was 50% affordable housing. Now they're talking about 31%, and actually in an FOI response I received from the LLDC, they're saying that could go down to 20%. Now, actually, what's very interesting there is today, I read in the newspaper, online, that Sadiq Khan's demand that there be a 50% affordable housing level is actually being worked on by the LLDC, which shows that this is a very political project. So if it's the case that Sadiq Khan's demand is met, they will push the affordable housing element back up to 50%, which of course would be very desirable. So who knows what will happen? But my point being that all of this stuff is manipulated as you go along. So you could end up with only somewhere around about 5,500 units. Remember, you lost around about 350 units at Clays Lane and Park Village, the two estates which were demolished. Genuinely affordable housing, social rent, what would be described now as social rent housing, as opposed to the kind of affordable rent, which could be up to 80%. So those minus figures also have to be factored in when you're looking at the affordable element. But in all of these situations, the statistics are constantly manipulated, and it's necessary to keep on top of exactly what they're saying, because if you look at the website, you can be misled by the idea that this is a 10,000 figure.
The catalytic effect is one of the statements that are made. Could you comment on that?
Well, the catalytic effect, I would come back to the statement that was made by Jason Pryor. Jason Pryor is saying that because of the Olympics, the project inside of the Olympic Park is slowed down. Now, the catalytic event is meant to be something that is bringing new change as part of this project, and it stimulates development all over the place. Inside of the Olympic Park, there is no development, virtually no development at all so far. So it's difficult to see how that can be described as a catalytic effect. But the more important part of this is, how do you look at this in the bigger context? And this is where you come back to Stratford City, which is this £4 billion programme right next door to the Olympic Park, and all of the other developments which are going on next door to it. So if you want to look at what is the catalytic effect, I would suggest the catalytic effect arises from the fantastic transport hub, which again has nothing to do with the Olympics, the existence of Stratford City, which again has nothing to do with the Olympics. That is what is driving development in the area. It's because of those things that you have all of the housing developments that have happened in Stratford High Street and in the area. Now, of course, at this point, now you've moved on and you have all of these other developments, it's virtually impossible to tell what arises from what. But I would say that the whole context here is that you have to look at this in terms of the plans that Newham had for the rail lands, because that is the big driver.
I wanted to ask you about jobs. We've done quite a bit of research monitoring the job situation. Could you say something about the kinds of jobs that were there, who might have worked in them, and the kinds of jobs that have come and who might be working in them?
Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting question, because obviously originally you had what was described as dirty industry in the Olympic Park, and for the most part this would be semi-skilled or manual labour, And for the most part, that would have been local people. I don't have an exact breakdown of where the people who were working in the Olympic Park came from, but the odds are that they were people from the vicinity. So in that instance, you're talking about local employment needs being met by companies which were working in the area. Now, all of that's gone. I mean, some of it, of course, it still exists in East London, but we're talking about the specific impact in that site. There are some companies, like, for example, Mr. Foreman has just moved across the canal. After a long battle, he's managed to stay in the area. Other companies have moved out of the area. The key issue is here, and the idea of a net gain is not one that I've created. This was what the LDA described. They looked at the loss of the just under 5,000 jobs, and then they described the creation of new jobs, and they described the creation of new jobs as a net gain. So they were taking into account the loss of jobs inside of the park when they were considering the job legacy that might arise from the Olympics. The problem with the new jobs that are going to come is that most of them, or a very considerable number of them, will not be done by the kind of population that lives in this area. We come here to the whole issue of the convergence agenda, which maybe we'll talk a bit more about in a moment. But the whole point here is, does this benefit the local area, or is this really about a new population coming in, and the jobs that come in are attuned really to that new population? And you'd have to say that, say, for example, I think that most of the people, apart from, of course, there'll be security guards and there will be a variety of ancillary workers, people working in administration and stuff like that, and if, say, for example, the V&A Museum is set up, or the kind of projects that are going to exist in here East, are much more likely to be done by people who are either coming in from outside or who are going to be a new population moving into the area. I don't blame the Olympics for gentrification, actually. Gentrification is happening in East London, but I do think it exacerbates that situation. And so you do have an emphasis on, because you've got rid of the kind of work that existed for local people, you have exacerbated those tendencies. Newham and Hackney and Tower Hamlets, or the western part of Newham, Tower Hamlets and Hackney, are undergoing severe gentrification anyway. And I'm afraid that is a process which was going to happen whether the Olympics came or not.
I wanted to ask you, what could be done? You have these people with lower skill levels competing. How do we get it so that we have a regeneration that actually does benefit local populations? Yeah,
well, I mean, we have a problem now because we got rid of those jobs, and I think that is a big problem. But okay, we now have that reality. I mean, obviously, I think you do have to talk about a very strong emphasis on skills and training, and I would say also, and this is where I would actually have some problems with some of the projects which are coming into the area, like, for example, UCL, the global university. I don't really see how its purpose, in terms of, say, for example, assisting with the convergence agenda. The convergence agenda is not just about making East London into a pale imitation of West London. It's about benefiting the people in this area. So if you have a university which is not attuned to actually meeting local needs and looking at local skills and developing those skills, which I think it's fair to say the existing universities are more attuned to doing, UEL and Birkbeck, I think it's a pity. I think that it would have been better either to have expanded the existing universities or to have created a new university based on Stratford, so that you were looking at the needs of local people. So I think that part of the problem here is that if you're looking for this kind of prestigious development, which to me is what the V&A and UCL represent, you're looking at it from the wrong end. You're starting from the top down, which actually the whole Olympic project is top down. And so instead of examining it from the perspective of local people, you're looking at it as trying to make this into an important site, in inverted commas, that has prestige and can be a marker, you might say, for the way in which East London will be transformed. But whether that's beneficial to local people is another matter altogether.
I wanted to ask you about the legacy venues, this idea of using a mega event. What's your views on that?
Yeah. Well, I think that again, you look at the particular stadiums which we've retained. The main stadium was intended to be an athletics facility, And now that may mean that you're going to have to invest money in it, but then you have to invest money in stadiums anyway. You have to invest money in Crystal Palace, for example. So they abandoned that project and they spent over £700 million on that. So you end up with a stadium which is not performing what was intended, which was to create a centre of excellence for athletics, which would be of use to the local people. Now, there is a communal track next door to it, so it's not a complete disaster, but you end up, again, with this emphasis on the 2-month window for elite athletes to come and perform. So you're back to this whole business of inspiring people through watching elite athletes. There's no indication that that produces improvements in sport participation. In fact, you go back to the game plan report. The game plan report predicted exactly this. It said you expect to get a kick in terms of sport participation, which will then fade away, and that is exactly what's happened. You don't get sport participation benefits of any substance from just watching other people. And so this has to be an investment program. If you're not prepared to invest, you're not prepared to put money into developing this stadium, then you end up with the kind of mess, really, that we've got, a very expensive stadium handed over to a football club. But I think the main problem with this site is that you have buildings which are there which prevent other kinds of development and in themselves don't really seem to me to perform much of a function for local people. You also have the orbit, which has no purpose at all, really, loses a lot of money, and is, again, taking up valuable land, which I hope is demolished very rapidly.
Here East, what do you think about Here East?
Well, Here East is claimed to be they claim it's going to produce 5,000 jobs. The figures that the LLDC provided for me about projections for jobs in the Olympic Park were that they said they're going to create 7,400 jobs by 2030. Now that's from the LLDC. I'm not making these figures up. So how do we arrive at the idea that Here East is going to create 5,000 jobs? Now, it could be, of course, that the LLDC's present predictions are incorrect. Maybe it will produce a lot more jobs. But again, we're talking about a project which seems to me to be much more aimed at a new population, rather than a population that exists in the area at the moment. I'm not particularly interested. I mean, I think it's a horrible building. I would quite happily see it demolished, but okay, it's been built, you spent the money on it. And I don't say it hasn't got any use, because you're going to create some jobs and hopefully it will become a genuine tech hub and all that kind of thing. So it's not that I'm sitting around sort of saying, well, this is a complete waste of time, but you go back to the original predictions, you go back to, for example, the LDA saying in 2006, we will be creating 6,000 net new jobs. So that means you've got to take the 5,000 jobs plus the 6,000 jobs that they're going to create. That's 11,000 total. And then, of course, since then, you've had Olympicopolis, which is another, supposedly, 3,000 jobs. That means the predictions were 14,000 jobs. But actually, the total the LLDC is at present stating is 7,400 jobs. And then if you put this in the context of the budget, which, of course, wasn't 2.37 billion, and is not 9 billion either, because the figures that the government uses and the ODA uses, they said, the Olympics came in within budget, which of course is not true, because that's the revised budget. But even that budget is incorrect, because, like, for example, the Taxpayers Alliance did freedom of information requests to ask local authorities and government departments and so on, and Quangos, what sort of money they were spending, which was off budget. In other words, every time the talk relay went anywhere, the local authorities spent money on security and all the other things that went on. I mean, Cardiff spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on this. So we're talking about lots of money was being spent, which is not declared. Now, the Taxpayers Alliance reckoned that the cost was 12 billion. Now, whether that figure is correct, I think the figures are opaque, basically. I mean, like, for example, the Security Minister, Baroness Neville-Jones, said at one point that much of the 1.13 billion security budget for 2012-2013 financial year would go on the Olympics. Now, that's not declared in the Olympic budget. What is much of? 500 million? I don't know. But the point being that you stick that into the budget, you stick into the fact that they haven't actually included the cost of buying the land and remediating the land, another £1 billion. That's not in the budget. I mean, they say they're going to recover it, but then you put it in the budget and then you recover it later on. The point being that all of these figures are up in the air. We don't know what the cost was. So you have to look at value for money. I mean, what exactly are we getting for all of this expenditure in terms of jobs? Well, according to the 7,400 figure, you're getting a net legacy of under 2,500 jobs. That figure may be incorrect, but that is really not a worthwhile investment. The people who are running these projects and the people who benefit from them in terms of industry are big corporations. So local companies didn't get into the act. If you're talking about local companies trying to bid to get into providing services, they were complaining that the process of filling in ODA's procurement forms was completely beyond them. So social enterprises were saying, we can't do this. And small companies were saying this. I was at the meeting, the previous meeting, the legacy meeting, and the guy from the the local chambers of commerce was there. And we had this discussion, and I said, well, actually, this is a problem for local businesses. And he said, yes, he's quite right, there was a problem. So local companies didn't get into this. And even for example, Spitalfields Market, which is right over the road from the other side of Rockall Road, the other side of the Olympic Park, they weren't used in order to provide food, vegetables and so on, for the Olympic project. So this is all handed over to big corporations. And they, of course, have their own subcontracting sectors. And so they call in people from other places, wherever they want them, and they will find rooms in the locality. So all of that is, I think, pretty opaque again. We don't really know that this did really benefit local people. The problem here is that the ODA, because we're talking about a development model here in which there isn't really local representation. We're talking about a very top-down project. You've created this development model, which unfortunately is now considered to be desirable for other big projects of this kind, which links up with central government and city government. You have a project which local people don't really get to have much influence over how that sort of project will develop. So whether the welcome project bid would have been good or not, I mean, to be honest, I wasn't really that interested in it. I think my main concern is the fact, I'm afraid, that the damage, to my mind, had already been done. I don't think that what happens later, I mean, I'm kind of cynical about the process that's happening later. What interests me now is if it's the case, for example, that Sadiq Khan does manage to push the affordable housing element up, that demonstrates how, if politicians wanted to assert themselves and make sure the project was going to be of benefit, then they had to argue that case and they had to push it through in the way that they wanted it to go. Boris Johnson had a very different agenda. So the damage which was done by buying up this land at a cheap value and removing the local jobs and so on, to my mind, you never really recover from that problem. From now, we're playing catch up. We're trying to do things to recover from damage which has been done, rather than something which was going to be beneficial from the beginning. Because, as I said before, my real case is that there was a really viable alternative development path which was going to happen. And that development path was knocked out by, I'm afraid, a process of simply lying, saying things which were not true about the area and about the fact that the land had no value. It had enormous value. I mean, the convergence, it's interesting to see, if you look at the local plan, the LDC's local plan, I haven't looked at the latest, the full document that they've produced since the hearings, but the draft plan only just mentions convergence. It doesn't spell it out. It doesn't actually give the whole convergence agenda, and it doesn't say, this is our objective, is to achieve the convergence agenda. It doesn't expressly set out how it's going to try and benefit the people living in this area in that way. So we have a project which isn't actually focused on what is meant to be the main planning objective. Now again, we come back to this business of, can you might say, address this issue after the event, because you've already done the damage. And again, you come back to the political will. Sadiq Khan can make decisions which will have an impact. if he pushes through the 50% affordable housing. Now, you have to look then, say, for example, at what use you can make of the land. Like, for example, you can say, well, we just had enough of this, this orbit construction. We get rid of it. That frees up some land for a further development, either industry or housing. So you start to remodel the park. And that is essentially what you're talking about, is to find ways of getting rid of some of the things which aren't performing. The main stadium, the problem with the main stadium is you're now tied into this contract with West Ham. Personally, I would get rid of the main stadium and put the money into developing Crystal Palace. Now, of course, you lost a lot of money in the process, but you're going to go on, to my mind, losing money on these sites. So both of those going. The one I forgot to mention actually was the copper box. The copper box may be the most useful of these original buildings, because it has multi-purpose capacity, and so you can use it for facilities, both athletics and also for local conferences and all kinds of other things. So as a facility, this may be the one which should be retained, the bubble, everything else. But I would say that you have to consider what exactly your long-term objectives are, and whether the Olympic Park, whether the sports facilities actually are the best use of this land. And if you look at the two sites, Stratford City and the Olympic Park is vast by comparison with Stratford City. But you look at what Stratford City has managed to create in terms of jobs and housing on a much smaller site. You've got a site which is supposed to create 33,000 jobs, and you've got a site which is going to have around about 5,000 homes. I can't remember exactly how many, because they're still building more stuff. But anyway, in total, you've got more or less the same in terms of housing on Stratford City in a very small site by comparison. And in terms of jobs, you've got a massive amount by comparison with what you've got on Stratford City, on the Olympic Park, in terms of a much larger site. So the Olympic Park, to my mind, is a poor use of land.